Britain, an island where history is part of the landscape. Where human feet have walked for 1 million years.
In this series, I'm going to explore Britain's distant past, from the earliest evidence of people in Britain right up to the moment that everything would change.
I'm going to discover how our ancestors survived from hunting and from gathering. I'll discover the technologies they used, the knowledge that they passed down, and the traces that they left behind.
I mean, it's mind-blowing. Yeah. 1 million years ago, right here, there was a family of people with mammoths.
This is the story of ancient Britain.
Get exclusive documentaries and ad-free podcasts with top historians. Watch on your smart TV or mobile device by downloading the History Hit app.
This is the Norfolk coast. I really love this landscape. It's one of my favourite places in Britain. I think it's probably the strong coastal erosion you get here creates a sense of wildness. There's a timeless nature to this landscape. And the wildlife here is incredible, but that's not what I'm here for today. I've come here because in May of 2014, one of the most important archaeological discoveries in British history was made. It was here that the first traces of humans in Britain were discovered.
To find out more, I'm meeting Dr David Waterhouse, part of the team that investigated this ancient evidence.
So David, this is where the discovery was made.
Yeah, around this kind of area here, it's nice and easy to spot because actually this is the base of the steps that you'd walk down from the cliff. So you can see just how far the cliffs have eroded in the past few years.
And it's that erosion that has been peeling back the layers of sediment, uncovering traces of Britain's distant past.
It was all really fortuitous. It just was more luck than anything else. We'd been coming back to do some dating work from the sediments, and it just so happens colleagues from the British Museum and Natural History Museum were here.
Talk about lucky, of all of the British coastline on that day, because the tide had exposed these footprints.
Yeah. So May storms, spring storms had basically sucked away all of this sand that you can see now, down to the estuary muds that are beneath our feet.
How far below us now?
Probably from looking at the groin, maybe a couple of metres, not that much.
Okay.
The sand changes every 12 hours, really. It's really dynamic here.
On that spring day, the tides revealed footprints in the mud, which might not seem surprising, except that the scientists knew just how old those footprints were.
So over the past 10 years before that, we'd been digging from 1 kilometre up the beach, taking away the beach sand and very carefully going into this layer. And these have been dated quite accurately, so we can really get to a very accurate date for the footprints.
Go on. So how old?
Well, either 850 or 950,000 years old. So getting on to 1 million years old.
That's astonishing. Human footprints from just shy of 1 million years ago.
Yeah.
Which are the oldest footprints ever found in Britain and in the Northern Hemisphere?
Yeah. In fact, we now know that they're the oldest footprints outside of Africa. And as you know, that's where humanity was first evolved. And the oldest right here on a little beach in Norfolk.
It's astonishing. It's so exciting. Now, these weren't people like you or I.
No, so they're the same genus as us, Homo, but probably a species called Homo antecessor, And I say probably because we actually haven't found any of the fossil remains. There's no bits of skull or bones. But we do know that in that time frame, 850,000 years ago, Homo antecessor was the only human species to have been found in Europe. Fossil remains have been found in Spain. So we're pretty sure that antecessor was here.
And how many footprints did you find?
About 49 in total, so quite a big area. Most of this area in front of us, between us and the sea, were covered with these footprints.
What could you tell from the footprints?
So probably a family group, which is the amazing thing. I mean, we've passed families on the way down today, and it would have been the same nearly 1 million years ago. An adult male, around maybe 5'8", so a little bit taller than me. Either a female or a teenager, maybe someone around 5'3", 5'4", and then at least 2, possibly 3 children. And what I love about it is the adults were walking kind of in a southerly direction, but these children were running all over the place. So again, exactly the same as a family today, but with the added kind of danger of hyenas and lions and things like that.
What a thought. I mean, that's astonishing. 1 million years ago, right here, there was a family of people walking through a landscape with mammoths. I think it's mind-blowing. I don't know what to say, really. I'm a bit blown away by it.
The ocean had revealed these long-lost footprints, but the ocean would also take them away.
These aren't hard rocks, these are soft sediments, even though they're nearly 1 million years old. Every 12 hours you've got the tide coming in covering them, and actually after 2 weeks the footprints had completely washed away. So there were a moment in time nearly 1 million years ago, they survived all that time under these cliffs, they were preserved, and then they were gone again within
It's amazing. I wish I could have seen them.
Well, you can see one of them because we've got digital copies in 3D of the entire set, but I've brought along a 3D printout which we've colour matched to the original of footprint number 30 of the 49.
I'm going to turn around so the sun is in my favour. Wow, that's really interesting. I would say, even age-wise, they were around 20.
Right, yeah.
It's a very high instep.
Yeah.
And it's quite a narrow foot. That interests me because a lot of people who are barefoot have high insteps but quite broad feet. But it's only 20 centimetres long.
Yeah.
So this is quite a short in stature.
Yeah. So at the very maximum, maybe 5'7", 5'8", something like that. And of course, they would have looked very similar to us.
It's very like our footprint.
Yeah, really closely related.
Wow, that is amazing to look at. Brilliant talking to an expert like David. He's painted such a picture for me. I can almost sense our ancestors walking here all those years ago. It reminds me of time I've spent with Aboriginal people foraging on the coast of northern Australia. I can hear the giggling of the children, for whom collecting shellfish was just fun, while the father or the adult male was looking around, keeping an eye out for dangers. Incredible the time that's elapsed since then. There's so much we don't know about those early ancestors, but when I look at the footprint, I see a person like you or I. But to sit here and the sea breaking on the shore, it's very evocative. You only have to close your eyes and you can be transported back to that time. One of the great difficulties in understanding prehistory is simply the vast scale of time that's being discussed. It's quite difficult to get a grasp on. So if I walk along this beach, and I imagine that I'm walking through time, and I pick a scale. Let's say 1 millimetre represents 1 year. And then the span of a human lifetime would have been passed in the distance of 3 of my fingers.
I'm starting at the Happisburgh footprints almost 1 million years ago. And I'm going to walk forwards through the ages, measuring out Britain's prehistory, until I reach recorded history in just the last 2 metres.
I'm racing through time. You know, it's really quite astonishing. Every step I take is just short of 1,000 years, but I've still got a long way to go. So I've come 350 metres, but I'm still 500 metres or 500,000 years from the modern age. But at this period in history, a different type of human left a different trace on this beach.
This tantalising discovery was made just a few hundred metres from the location of the footprints, and yet it is separated by hundreds of thousands of years.
There was a dog walker just walking along this beach, as we've seen lots of dog walkers today, and he just saw a little kind of black or very dark line sticking out of the sediment. And I can show you what he saw. He essentially saw that sticking out of the mud.
The edge of a hand axe.
Yeah, and that was the first hand axe that was found in situ within that mud in this area.
And so, how old would that have been?
Well, actually, the story of it is a bit complicated, because when it was first discovered, they'd only just found similar remains in Pakefield in Suffolk, and that was dated to 700,000 years old. So it was assumed this was about 700,000 years old. We now know it's 500,000, so knock off a couple of 100,000 years, but that's still 500,000 years old.
That makes this one of the oldest hand axes ever found in Britain.
So we're potentially talking about a different species again.
Yeah. So the Happisburgh footprints were made by Homo antecessor. This is really typical of other hand axes that were found in the UK from places like Boxgrove, which I know you've been to. And this is a human species called Homo heidelbergensis.
Fascinating.
Of course, first found in Heidelberg in Germany in the early 1900s, and we know they were living here as well 500,000 years ago.
Now this is a replica of the original.
Yeah.
But you can see every flake scar, you can see the hinge fracture here where someone had a problem.
Yeah.
You always have this when you're working flint. But what really interests me about these is you don't have to go to all this length to make this tool.
Yeah.
You could just break a cobble and it would do a similar job.
Yeah.
So we've got the first example of art, of form. Yeah. Symmetry is beautiful.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
Stone tools like this are one of our only windows into the lives of our distant ancestors. So how did they make and use stone tools? To demonstrate, I've come to one of Britain's last remaining flint quarries, just outside Norwich.
Wow, look at the size of that, that's fantastic.
You can see the flint layers in the face.
Yeah.
And they go right across the whole site.
So how old is that?
The chalk here is some of the youngest in Europe. It's about 70 to 80 million years old. Obviously layers of seabed over the years compressed.
Embedded in this layer of chalk, there are nodules of hard flint. How they got there is still something of a mystery.
So nobody really knows
No
what
one really
flint is,
no, but
how it was formed. But one of the theories is that these are the remains of sea sponges.
Sea sponges.
I've always felt that if you pardon the pun, holds water.
it makes sense, doesn't it?
It does, when you see the way that they form, you can, that was the seabed,
and that's where they laid.
Tens of millions of years ago.
And them layers will go right through the whole site, all the way down. Just keep going.
When the quarry started, they were only interested in the chalk. The lumps of flint were a waste product.
We never done nothing with it back in the day. It's something we started in the last 30 years.
But for our ancestors, this wasn't an easy material to obtain. I mean, you've got heavy machinery. They only had antler picks.
Yeah.
And there they were driving shafts down in search of the material. I mean, to start with, it's a hit and miss process where you actually hit the flint.
Yeah, it is. And we're quite lucky because we do it in levels. So we uncover an acre, 2-3 acres at a time with a disc harrow. So when we do find a level, it is a layer of flint across the whole site. But if you're going straight down the hole, you might catch that piece and that piece, but you might miss the good stuff.
It's interesting, isn't it? It makes me think about the value of flint, particularly in the Neolithic, when there was this increased demand for large axes to help fell trees to clear the land for agriculture. It must have been an expensive commodity even back then.
Yes, I think even like now, there's a lot of work going to getting a ton of flint from when we lift it from the face, which go through 3 more processes before it goes to the flint napping area. Then it's napped and bagged and weighed, and it's probably a 5 or 6 process operation to get the flint into the bag.
The flint mined here is primarily used on buildings and walls, but I want to use it as our ancestors did, to make tools. I just need to find the right piece.
Let's have a little look around.
Too much choice.
Yeah, sport fit. That's the problem. I can't see what I need now because it's all too available, isn't it? It's nice to get stuff that rings. When it rings, it's got fewer cracks in it. Beautiful black colour. Really lovely, isn't it? That's nice. We'll take that piece. But I need to find a couple of other bits really as well.
Our ancestors went to extraordinary lengths to obtain the right flint. At Grimes' graves, Neolithic miners, some of them children, dug over 400 shafts using tools made of red deer antler in search of the perfect stone. But once you've got your stone, your work has only just begun.
One of the strange things about flint is that if you hit it, it breaks with a mussel shell shaped fracture, a conchoidal fracture, conch shape, which means that you hit it in one direction, but the shock waves travel out at 120 degrees. So you can see the piece I knocked off earlier. I hit it at this angle and a blade came off there. And that's basically the principle of flint working. So if I work away around this platform, I may be able to knock some blades off. Now the white outer surface is called cortex, and that acts as a shock absorber, so it's good to try and remove that early on. You can see how I'm starting to control the face here of the flint, and all of the pieces that I've knocked off are like razor blades, actually very sharp, very usable. An awful lot of the waste material from the production of stone tools was of course used in the past, but may not even show up in the archaeological record today. Now we start to get blades coming off with less cortex, and these are the razor blade of the past. That's very, very sharp. And at this point I'm going to change hammer to a slightly softer hammer made of antler here, and I'm going to use it in this way. Really, the secret to working flint is knowing how to deal with the problems that you face, because you constantly encounter problems when you work flint. It's as you can see, it's full of little inclusions, and it doesn't perform in a completely uniform way. And so the flint knapper must know how to deal with these issues. Sometimes the easiest way is simply take a hard hammer and come back beyond the problem, or you can attack it sideways on, depending on the nature of the flint. I want to try and make what we'd call a core tool, which is a tool made from the piece of flint, and everything else is sort of carved away, if you like. What I want to do is get rid of the cortex without losing too much width from the piece. This antler is incredibly tough material. It's a bit of red deer antler. You can see just how tough it is. I'm going to a harder hammer. What I like is the sound. This is the sound of the past. So what I've done, I made basically a very small hand axe, but I'm moving beyond that. I want to make a knife if I can, which means thinning this more without losing too much width, which is the real skill in flint knapping. It's a tricky business. I've got rid of most of the cortex. I could live with that if it stays in the middle. In the hand axe, you start to see the beginnings of art. So way back in the Paleolithic, there is an aesthetic. I mean, the Acheulean hand axe, which is almond-shaped, that was a form that went all around the world, and really I don't think it has any particular function. It feels nice in the hand. It's more about it was pleasing to the eye, it was symmetrical. One of the great difficulties in understanding prehistory is simply the vast scale of time that's being discussed. If I walk along this beach and I imagine that I'm walking through time, and I pick a scale.
1 millimetre is 1 year. Then the story of the human occupation of Britain would stretch about 1 kilometre. From the earliest traces, footprints almost 1 million years old, to recorded history just the last 2 metres.
So out of all this vast period in time, archaeologists have divided it into convenient periods, if you like, largely based on the stone tools that are found, the technology that existed. You have the Paleolithic, the old Stone Age, the longest period,
lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Almost 99% of our timeline is the Paleolithic.
When we travel like this through the Paleolithic, we are travelling on such a vast timescale that we witness Britain covered by ice sheets which force people out of this land. It becomes uninhabitable, and the traces of these ice ages are to be seen in the cliffs here, where the sediments left down by the meltwaters as the ice receded. And there were several periods during this time when people couldn't live in Britain.
But when the ice retreated during the so-called interglacial periods, people returned to Britain. Ours is a story of waves of migration. And finally, around 40,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, were living here.
They've made this journey from Africa through the Middle East and have found their way to Britain. But we are still in the old Stone Age. Why did our ancestors continue in this way for so long without change? And I think it's because the technology they employed worked. It worked for what they were doing.
For almost a kilometre I've been walking the Paleolithic, but now finally I'm approaching the end of the Old Stone Age.
You see that flag? That represents today. And now I'm about 12 metres from today, 12,000 years into the past, and I leave the Paleolithic. I'm now entering the Middle Stone Age, the Mesolithic. It's an interesting time. There's a very great change in the use of stone tools. Now, instead of heavy hand axes, we see the use of tiny flakes of flint. It's a fascinating and mysterious period in history.
Britain, an island where history is part of the landscape, where human feet have walked for 1 million years.
In this series, I'm going to explore Britain's distant past, from the earliest evidence of people in Britain right up to the moment that everything would change.
I'm going to discover how our ancestors survived from hunting and from gathering. I'll discover the technologies they used, the knowledge that they passed down, and the traces that they left behind.
I mean, it's mind-blowing. Yeah, 1 million years ago, right here, there was a family of people with mammoths.
This is the story of ancient Britain.
Get exclusive documentaries and ad-free podcasts with top historians. Watch on your smart TV or mobile device by downloading the History Hit app.
In the first programme, we saw how our oldest ancestors made and used flint tools like hand axes. Flint was also used to make spears, the main weapon of the Paleolithic hunter.
During the Mesolithic, there was a revolutionary change in hunting technology. Perhaps it came about because there was an increase in vegetation in the landscape, but it's in the Mesolithic that the bow and arrow were invented, and that would change hunting forever. To really understand the bow and arrow, it's good to have a look at the arrow more closely, because actually it's quite a sophisticated tool. And I'm going to make one to show you.
Organic matter rarely survives, so what we know of Mesolithic arrows comes from the stone arrowheads we've found. I'm going to make my arrowhead here at one of Britain's only flint quarries. I start with a flake left over from making a flint hand axe.
A deer antler like this roe deer antler here is very useful for a different type of flint working where we apply pressure directly to the edge. What I'm looking at making is a leaf point arrowhead, and this end of the flint is thick, so that'll be the point, because it's difficult to slot the thick end of the flint into the shaft, and the thinner end will be the base of the point. So the first job is to start to take control of the shape, and also to thin down the thick end a little bit by driving some little flakes, micro flakes, across the surface of the flint. And I go backwards and forwards as I work my way along the edge. When you consider that we used flint tools for most of human history, you probably won't then be surprised to learn that there are certain revolutions that took place in the manufacturing technology and the way we did things with this material in the past. And archaeologists can classify the time period a tool was made by the technique that was employed to produce it. But of course, technological advancements back then took much longer than today. We live in an age where we expect revolutionary changes in technology overnight. Things took much longer in the past.
I'm making a leaf-shaped arrowhead, one of the simplest designs, but later arrowheads developed barbs to make them stick into the prey. The craftsmanship of some of these flints is extraordinary.
Our ancestors were clever, and if you've ever tried to work flint, you very quickly discover how clever they were, how skilled they were. Working flint is quite fun, and in many ways you go on a voyage of discovery of our evolutionary past when you work this material. And at any stage in the production, one slip and it can break, because this is akin to glass. So it's strong and sharp, but it's also fragile. So there it is, and you can see it has a naturally serrated edge. I've used the thick end of the blade for the point for strength, and the thinner end so that it can easily be mounted. So the next task for this is to actually turn it into an arrow.
And that means it's time to go back to the forest to find some wood.
This is hazel. It wouldn't be my choice of wood, and neither would it have been, I think, our ancestors' choice of wood. A much better choice would be Guelder rose, which is stiffer. But when needs must, there's no Guelder rose here. The hunter must use what's available to him. And I'll collect a few sticks for this purpose. I base what I'm doing on what I've seen hunter-gatherers do in Africa. I'm going to take off the bark, and I now need to dry this wood and straighten it. I know it looks quite straight, but an arrow needs to be very straight to be accurate. I quite like making arrows like this. It may seem time consuming, but yeah, our ancestors had plenty of time. I need to dry the moisture out of the wood so that it stiffens it and also prevents it, it'll shrink in the process. If I don't do that, then of course once I've tied anything onto it, the wood will shrink and everything comes loose. A few minutes ago this was a stick, and it's not a stick anymore, it's becoming an arrow, and the key tool in finding food. I'm just hardening the point. Driving the moisture out makes it harder. Okay, so here's the arrowhead, and I have to fit that neatly into the shaft. I'm cutting a groove for the arrowhead. So if you're walking along and you find something like that in the countryside, you know you've found a little Stone Age chisel. These skills really taught me to appreciate our ancestors. Oh, I think we're there. Yep. So there is the arrowhead fitted in place.
The arrowhead is attached using resin glue, which is thermoplastic. It softens when heated and hardens when cooled. Then I attach the feathers, tying them on using strands of plant fibre.
I've done this quickly. It would be nice to take a little bit longer. I would make it a lot neater than this, but it gives you a pretty good impression of what things would have looked like all those years ago. Only one thing remains, and that's to test it. Sadly, very few bows survive from the Mesolithic. We know they were used because we find the projectile points to tell us they were using arrows. Well, what I can tell you is that the bow, when it arrived, was a revolutionary discovery in hunting terms. It's light, it's small, it's compact, it's versatile. You can make many different types of arrow to fit the bow for different jobs. And with a bow, you can quickly and easily reach out through thick undergrowth to hit your target. This is a bow I've made from wych elm. It's a copy of a bow that was found in Denmark, and it shoots extremely well. A sweet little flat bow. This is exactly the sort of bow that would be used with this sort of arrow. The arrow flew beautifully straight. If there'd been a red deer sleeping here in this couch, you can see here, it would have been within range. The arrowhead's dislodged a little bit, but that's an easy fix over the fire. You just soften the glue and fix it back in place.
Our ancestors used technology like this for hunting, but they were also gatherers, collecting wild plant foods from the land. So what kind of environment did they live in?
It's hard to imagine what Britain looked like through the vast timescale of the Paleolithic. Certainly there were times when our country was a vast Arctic tundra, but by the Mesolithic things start to warm up. And by the end of that period, our hunter-gatherers were living in a vast, tangled, moist, warm woodland.
There is no truly ancient woodland left in Britain, but here at Puzzlewood in Gloucestershire, you can get some sense of what Britain might have been like.
We know so little about our hunter-gatherer past. What we do know is that tools are often found at rocky overhangs. Perhaps these were more than just shelters, but fixed points in the landscape that people could navigate to on a seasonal basis. Well, one thing I'm certain of, our ancestors' knowledge of the flora and fauna was exceptional.
And they needed every bit of that knowledge to survive.
The big demand for them on a daily basis was for food. They had to be very adept at finding things that could be eaten in nature. Not everything's edible. At this time of year, things like this, the wild garlic, would certainly have been used. These little flower buds are like pearls of garlic flavour. And of course, at this time of year, at the end of the winter, the beginning of the spring, the diet would have been nutrient deficient. So the sudden flood of salady plants into the forest would have been of great importance. But this plant is more than just food. It's in the onion family, and the juice from that plant can be used as a mild antiseptic. Other things too, like here growing on the rock, there's the polypody fern. This has been used to treat sore throats across northern Europe. The root of the plant, I won't pull it up because I don't want to damage it, but the root has kind of a bitter licorice flavour too. The secret was to know what could be used and where it grows, so that if you see the right habitat, you know what to look for when you get there.
Hunter-gatherers also need to be acutely aware of the seasons.
You know, I absolutely love this time of year because we get so many nice salad plants are coming up. This is golden saxifrage. It's a real golden green colour, and it's a slightly bitter green, but it's nice again in salads. And it's lovely, and it's moist because there was rain last night as well, so it's just delicious. And I'm sure the way I feel is equally the way our ancestors would have felt as the sun starts to climb in the sky at the end of the winter. The staple foods for our ancestors at that time are difficult to establish. We take the availability of potato and rice and wheat so much for granted. But for our hunter-gatherer ancestors, none of those foods were available. For them, they had to be sharp and ready for seasonal gluts like the hazelnut harvest. One can imagine communities preparing gathering baskets in advance of the ripening of the hazelnuts. Acorns were also an important food source. Once oak was growing, that was an abundance of carbohydrate to be gathered. But you can't just eat it raw because it's so rich in tannin. That has to be washed out. So you can imagine again, specialized baskets, not just for storage, but also for leaching out the tannins, perhaps in slow flowing streams. Now this is a site that would have delighted Mesolithic foragers. This is a lime tree, the linden tree. And at this time of year, when the leaves are just opening, they're soft and emerald green, they're as near as you get to lettuce in the wild larder. But this was a useful tree too. The bark from it can be used to make rope. It gets its name, lime, derived from linden or lime tree. The wood is also light and strong and easily carved and could be used to make all manner of utensils, perhaps even dugout canoes. One of my theories is that the bark from large lime trees may well have been the covering of the shelters for many hunter-gatherers in Britain during the Mesolithic.
Hunting and gathering was the lifestyle of the first humans in Britain and lasted almost 1 million years, nearly all of the 1,000 metres on our beach timeline. But just 6 metres from the present day, the Mesolithic comes to an end. It's now the Neolithic, the new Stone Age, and there's a new way of life.
Around 4000 BC, it's believed that a new type of people arrived in Britain. They brought with them a revolution in food production, farming.
Instead of relying on wild plants and animals, we now planted crops, domesticated versions of naturally occurring plants that had been selected for their high yields, and they domesticated animals, starting with sheep and goats.
Farming had had its origins in the valleys of the upper Euphrates around 12,000 BC, so it took 6,000 years to come here. But when it did, it changed everything. All of a sudden, there was a hunger for land. Flint tools changed, they evolved. It's at this time we see polished axes that are resilient for the felling of trees. Hafted in wood or antler and wood, they would see the clearance of a lot of the natural landscape. It's also believed that the early farmers had a nutrient-poor diet. They weren't eating such a diverse range of foods as the hunter-gatherers, who relied a lot on fish and on wild greens harvested from nature. Personally, I'd rather be a hunter-gatherer than a farmer.
It's thought that early farmers actually had shorter life expectancy than their forebears. Nevertheless, the farming lifestyle did have some advantages.
People had a store of food to see them through difficult times. It led to more time for culture and also for warfare. All of a sudden, people needed land, and good land was worth protecting and fighting for. This changed the landscape of Britain forever. A lot of the fields that we're used to today had their origins at this time. It may be strange to think, but in many parts of Britain where we see bigger open fields, those fields may have been cleared during this period, the Neolithic.
And our ancestors started to build permanent structures, physical manifestations of their beliefs that survive to this day.
I've never been here before, and I'm keen to see this. This is Belus Nap, which is a burial mound from the Neolithic. It's over 5,500 years old. This impressive entranceway is a little bit puzzling. Although there were some skeletons found behind the big stone, there's no chamber. It could well be that this represents perhaps a gateway to the afterlife in the minds of the people who built this monument. You could be forgiven for thinking that this is all hollow inside, but it's actually not. The burials were made in small chambers along the sides. But if you come around here, you can see the scale of it. It's a great long slightly tapered mound. It obviously had some symbolic meaning to the religious life of the Neolithic farmers in this area. I find it fascinating. Maybe this is some sort of vehicle to ensure the safe transportation of spirits to the afterlife. Lovely cowslips growing on top of it. That's a nice sight. There were 14 skeletons in here of varying ages. I'm not going to go inside because to me this is a place of the dead, and I think it's good to respect the spirits of the past. But isn't it stunning? I mean, it's a beautiful testimony to the care with which people were buried. I mean, I find places like this interesting. There's a huge investment of labour gone into making this, which means that people felt that the afterlife, their mortality, these things were of significance. It is a bit of a puzzlement though as well at the same time. Why didn't earlier cultures do the same thing? Well, maybe they didn't have the time. They were too busy foraging and hunting. Farmers have more time, and also farmers rely on a seasonal connection with the land in a slightly different way. A forager can move around a landscape and go to a resource as it flowers or it fruits, or if the salmon run, they can position themselves in the right place. But a farmer, they lock themselves statically in the landscape. They clear a space, they make their fields, they bring in their livestock, and they say, this is where I live. And they are then at the whim of the elements. So there can be a degree of superstition that creeps into the farming life, particularly given the vagaries of fluctuations in climate and weather patterns. It's hardly surprising that perhaps for these people there was a sense of divine intervention or divine malice even in their fortunes, which would make them think more carefully about the next life and the spirit world. Interestingly, in this particular chamber, some of the skulls showed signs of violence, of the heads being crushed in, and it's believed that that could represent early conflict in the Neolithic period. Of course, the other aspect to these sort of monuments is that they define the length of occupation that you and your clan have been in a place. It's a further attestation of this is ours. Perhaps that's something that's more in the mind of new arrivals in a landscape. It's quite a thought.
And now the pace of change gets even faster. In Britain, the Neolithic lasts just a couple of thousand years, only 2 meters on our 1 kilometer timeline. The Stone Age is about to come to an end with the discovery, the harnessing of metal.
I'm on Happisburgh Beach, North Norfolk. I've been walking a timeline through history. I've taken the scale of 1 millimetre equals 1 year.
I've walked almost a kilometre so far, and through all of that time the dominant technology was based on stone.
But I haven't yet reached the flag that represents today. I started with the earliest human footprints found in Britain, 850 metres back in that direction. And I'm standing right now at one of the most important discoveries in history, the use of iron, a revolutionary new material.
This metal would herald a new age, the Iron Age, that would transform the landscape, the way we live, and the way we fight. Britain, an island where history is part of the landscape, where human feet have walked for 1 million years.
In this series, I'm going to explore Britain's distant past, from the earliest evidence of people in Britain right up to the moment that everything would change.
I'm going to discover how our ancestors survived from hunting and from gathering. I'll discover the technologies they used, the knowledge that they passed down, and the traces that they left behind.
I mean, it's mind-blowing. Yeah, 1 million years ago, right here, there was a family of people with mammoths.
This is the story of ancient Britain. Like all of our prehistory, the Iron Age is shrouded in mystery. But clues can be found if you know where to look.
This beautiful landscape is Puzzlewood, deep in the heart of the Forest of Dean. But this is not a natural landscape. This is a post-industrial landscape. These features were formed by the picks of miners who came here first in the Iron Age looking for iron ore.
Because the iron ore here is exposed at the surface, it was possible to reach it using open cast mining techniques, the earliest form of iron ore mining.
When you look at a face like this, you see this like crazy paving effect. That's the result of the tips of the miners' picks when they were searching for iron ore here. Today, of course, they're very weathered over time, but that is the lasting testimony to the presence of miners here. The rock here is mostly limestone, but you find within it little patches that look rusty. That's a remnant of the iron, and you can see all the little pick marks here quite clearly where miners had worked this area. Probably they found a seam here and followed it through. It could well be that this area was known long before the discovery of iron, because you also find in the rocks here hematite, red ochre, and it could well be that people were collecting that in this area for ceremonial purposes thousands of years earlier.
But around 800 BC, the knowledge of how to work iron reached Britain, probably spreading from Europe. Soon, iron-rich rock became a very important resource.
Actually, iron is a very abundant mineral, so that, coupled with its great malleability and workability and toughness, made it the super metal that would power us into the industrial age.
To find out more about why iron is so important, I'm meeting up with blacksmith Joe Tyler.
Joe, there's the man I've come to see. So I reckon you would have been one of the most important people in a community in the Iron Age.
Yeah, well, hopefully, for anything from a tool for everyday use to weapons to fight battles and trade with.
An amazing material, iron.
It is. It's so versatile. We still even use it today, of course.
And it's abundant.
And it is, yeah, very.
Iron wasn't the first metal to be worked. Copper and gold were discovered much earlier. Later, bronze, an alloy of copper with other metals, was found to be superior to pure copper. But iron proved to be even more useful than bronze.
It can do the same things, but you can do more of it. It can hold a better edge. It's slightly stronger. It's almost like something from the gods themselves, I would imagine at the time. You know, something. It's almost like a godly material, because they've been able to survive and trade and work with this bronze all this time. Then this iron comes, and then they start working it and thinking, we can do more with this. And yeah, it seems like it must have been a godly material.
It would have brought a refinement to everything else too.
Yeah.
So the woodworking gets easier because it's easier to keep it sharp. It's not a hassle you're sharpening bronze. You can sharpen bronze, but it's quite complicated to do it by comparison to steel.
With these advantages, iron was able to revolutionise almost every area of life, from fighting to farming.
Come on, let's make something.
Okay, so we've got some flat bar here. I'll just bring them up to a heat. So Although we're using a slightly more modern version of a forge, it's the same principle. What's not changed in thousands of years is you need an air source, basically a tube or air pipe to come through, and a pit. And that's what I think I like. That's what's really attracted me to go into blacksmithing, is the fact that thousands of years, not a lot has changed, and the tools definitely haven't changed. The tongs and the hammers are all still the same. And
the smell and the sound is the same.
Yeah, it is. It's almost like you're stepping back into history when you're working sort of traditional equipment and tools.
This one's looking all right.
Yeah,
Shall I have a...
Yeah, have a little bash, go for a tapered point. But it's like, so when you're looking at apprentices in the past, you would have someone on the bellows constantly, and which makes it a little bit easier for the smith. At the same time though, it might seem like a bit of a daunting task to be on the bellows all the time, but as an apprentice, you're getting to witness the secrets that other craftspeople are trying to find out, and I think that's quite special to be able to witness your master craftsman at work, and you're assisting that, and you're learning the techniques for you to then possibly take it on after.
It's really interesting. It's a magical process.
It is,
and of course the great thing is you can easily reuse things. So a tool one day breaks, you turn it into something else.
Exactly. Anything like a rivet or a nail or a hook, it's all useful.
Yep.
I'm making a sickle, an important tool that allowed farmers to quickly harvest grain for human consumption and grass for animals.
I'm just tapering this down to make the tang, that's the part of the blade that will fit into the handle.
So at the moment, what we're going to do is we're going to just make the tang, as Ray said, and then we're going to flip this round, and we're going to do a long taper, and then once we've got that long taper, we'll do it to eye, and then we'll start bending it around to sort of form the sickle hook.
Yep.
The key to making a good sickle is getting the curved blade just the right shape.
I'm hammering in the bevel of the edge of the sickle. This gives it its triangular cross section, if you like. And this is a right-handed sickle, and I see Joe's making a left-handed version.
Then it's just a matter of adding a wooden handle.
The last little job, how's that? Ah, lovely. And one of the most important tools for the agricultural societies of the day, the sickle, for the harvesting of their crops. Fantastic. Joe, it's been brilliant working with you today.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. It's like it brings the past to life, and you know, I think what I'm left with is this feeling of how capable Iron Age Britons were, and how, you know, their curiosity aroused by this material must have been fascinating.
Yeah, it must have been, and I wish I was there for the first time it was done, to witness that, sort of that magic. But at the end of the day, I'm very fortunate to do this and sort of almost live in the past a little bit in my own way.
This is a a little bit of an experiment really, but it feels good. It's got a good balance. You know, iron is an amazing material. Until iron came along, if you wanted to reshape something, you had to melt the bronze down and recast it, which means making a mold of the right shape. But iron, you could take this out into the field. I could do so today. I could go and cut a crop and see how well it worked. And if I didn't think it was quite the right shape, I only have to go back to the forge, reheat it and reshape it. It's malleable. And then I can try again. So it gives you the opportunity to experiment and to perfect tools. This would therefore provide a revolution in agriculture. Ploughs would improve. It was easier to clear the ground with iron axes, which are more easy to sharpen and to maintain. And with that, of course, came an increased demand for the land itself, for agriculture. People would start to defend their property. And what would they look to provide their weapons? Iron. Now we see the development of the iron spear, the iron sword, the shield, and the organisation of culture where farmers and communities band together to defend their property.
And evidence of those conflicts can be found throughout Britain in the extraordinary structures left behind from the Iron Age called hill forts. This is the spectacular Malvern Hills, and I'm heading for one of my favourite places in Britain.
There's a bracing wind up here. There was a frost last night, but by golly, it's brilliant. It makes you feel alive. Literally breathtaking in every way. Fabulous. I mean, this has to be your archetypal hill fort. You can see the ramparts of the past. Mysterious features in the British landscape, and this is British Camp, aptly named. It's the most incredible view from up here. Absolutely stunning. I've been up this hill a few times over the years, and it never ceases to amaze. It's just brilliant. I think the first thing that strikes you when you come up here is the impressiveness of the earthworks. There's a lot of work to excavate all of this, and of course the ditches would have been steeper and deeper, and it's believed that they had a palisade going around them of stakes in some way. These would have been very impressive features in the landscape. They give a wonderful view across the landscape, but they also impose a presence on the landscape. They define a territory. This is our place. And it gave the tribes that use these hill forts the opportunity to control the trade and movement through their areas. There were major hill forts and minor hill forts. And you can see how large and impressive this is. Some of them have evidence of battles and some don't. But there again, sometimes you have an enemy that's so powerful you don't want to go to war with them.
To find out more about the Iron Age tribes who constructed this fort, I'm meeting local archaeologist Aidan Smith.
What do we know about the culture of the people?
Well, the Iron Age used to be just characterised as a warrior culture, and that's all they thought about. But consider the gold that they were making, the gold talks. It's fantastic, the artwork that they were creating. It can't just be a warrior class. There was certainly a warrior elite, but it's not just based on war. Out there in the environs, we've got huge evidence for farmsteads. Just on Wells Road, not long ago, last year, we found a production site, a pottery production site. So there's a wealth of evidence around the site, not just on the site. It's best to think of hill forts as being associated with the landscape, not separate from it.
I mean, they're basically a power hub.
Exactly.
Within the landscape.
Exactly.
So would there have been a chieftain here?
I think there would. And at some point a chieftain had this made, had this created. I think he'd probably only visit seasonally, because if he's the chief of the Dobuni, he's got quite a territory to control. probably come here in special festivals. They are up here at some time in the year, and everyone down there is physically looking up at them. So it's just instilling that hierarchy again into society. It may well have been a place where the Druids lived as well with the chieftains, again seasonally, because they're doing other things in wetlands. There's lots of ritual activity in different parts of the landscape in the Iron Age.
The design of the ramparts and the defences is obviously steep.
Yes.
It was a very good defence.
Yes.
But it was also quite maze-like.
Exactly, yeah. The very interesting thing about most hill forts is they generally have one very convoluted entrance with lots of left and right turns. Now that would be a fantastic defensive structure. On the gate you may well, instead of having the timber wall, you may have had a stone wall with a timber bridge going across the banks either side so you can throw stuff down. Timber gate, very hard to get through, but then the south entrance, there's practically nothing. It's almost a straight line in. So I think the defences, or the complicated entrance, is actually more important the way you walk through it.
Fascinating. I mean, and what of you? I mean, if you were the chief, you could look down on all of your subjects.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
So I guess it would have been more wooded, perhaps, with small
farmsteads. Yeah, I mean, the landscape isn't that different really. We'd have had more elm wood, but it's not a million miles away from what it was. Obviously, the field and enclosures would be very different, dotted with farmsteads, as you say, and you'd be able to see this aspect that we are very familiar with, double ditch enclosures and the Iron Age settlements within those, and they would be all across the landscape. And of course, most of these little hills that you can see would have a little hill fort on them as well.
Britain has over 3,000 hill forts. This is one of the most spectacular.
Aidan, this hill fort's really quite something, because this isn't soft chalk that they are quarrying. I mean, this is limestone.
Yeah, with antler tools as well. Yeah, it's phenomenal, isn't it? But I doubt that they were using antler tools on rock like this. I think like earlier periods in history, they were probably setting a fire underneath the stone, on the stone, and then throwing water on it for it to crack.
Right. It's impressive. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, I've often wondered where the stone goes.
Where does the stone go? Yeah.
So that then, if you're thinking about the major entrance and having a stone wall around it, it starts to make sense. We haven't got evidence of it now because the medieval...
They would have pinched it.
Exactly.
So all that's visible now are the earthworks. But once, the fort would have contained buildings such as roundhouses. Only faint traces of those structures now remain.
This looks like the site of a roundhouse.
This area
this little area here. Entrance facing southeast, which is normal for roundhouses.
So am I walking around it now?
You're walking around. You're inside it.
I'm inside.
You're inside.
So it's quite a big roundhouse.
Yeah, and you're just reaching the edge now.
So this is it.
This is it.
Yeah, I can see it better from here.
Fire in the middle.
Yep.
So people all around doing different functions. We know that they had different parts of the roundhouses to do different things.
It's hard now to imagine what these buildings were like, but fortunately I don't have to. This is Butser Ancient Farm on the South Downs. Here they've reconstructed a number of Iron Age dwellings based on evidence found in hill forts. Showing me around is their resident archaeologist, Claire Walton.
Claire, how are you?
Hi Ray, welcome to the Iron Age. Would you like to take a tour of some of the facilities?
I would love to. You know, I haven't been here for probably 30 years, so I'm really excited.
So this house, the original archaeology for this house is just south of Salisbury.
Okay.
And it was a very famous example of roundhouses excavated. The archaeologist who led the excavations was a gentleman called Bersu, and he was very famous for proving for the first time that the people of prehistory didn't actually live in holes in the ground, which is what people used to think. We find that unbelievable now, but that was the narrative in the 1930s.
We always underestimate the sophistication of our
Yeah,
cultures.
I definitely agree. So this is the lovely entrance to the building with these huge big doors, and people have wondered whether this was actually an agricultural building and that the doors were so big to allow the entrance of carts. It certainly allows a big draft in, but if you go inside, one thing you'll notice is that it's quite dark because there isn't a hole in the roof, and so the smoke from the fire is drifting up into the roof and percolating out through the thatch rather than being drawn up very quickly through a hole. And of course you can imagine what would happen if you did have a hole and the fire was being drawn up into the roof. We're very lucky we have never accidentally set fire to any building here. Touch
these
something
would
with
go,
them.
yes.
Yes, they would. So welcome to the biggest of our roundhouses here on the site.
Wow, it's quite an impressive space, isn't it, as soon as you come in?
It's very beautiful. It's hard to imagine living in this space as it is now, but archaeological evidence would suggest that larger roundhouses like this one would have been divided up. So the peripheral space around the edge of the building would probably have been divided up by panelling, it has been suggested. So each of these could have been discrete areas for doing different activities.
Or different families.
An
even.
alternative suggestion has actually been that you could keep animals in that area around there. And in one of the houses I'm going to show you in a minute, the phosphate evidence suggests that animals were stalled inside that building.
It's very interesting.
So it's not just people inside these houses.
I mean, I've had the privilege to work with cultures around the world that inhabit spaces similar to this. And I've seen in Venezuela that there are peoples who live in multi-families in a space just like this. And then in other parts of the world, in Africa, I've seen houses that are very dark, where livestock is kept inside the house and it's kept dark to keep flies from coming in.
Well, people often talk about the smoke in these houses, and this isn't a good example because the smoke is going way above our head.
Yes.
But in some of the smaller ones, the smoke ceiling's very low and it's literally just at head height. And people often say, how could anyone have lived in here? Or there's no way they could have had a second floor because it would have been in the smoke ceiling. But what we're forgetting is that it could have been the lesser of two evils. So what would you rather have, the biting insects or the smoke? And the evidence of, so take Ötzi, the Iceman. Now his body has been examined in great detail and they've concluded that his lungs were quite badly damaged by smoke. And now he wasn't necessarily some unique person, so we can extrapolate from that that's kind of representative of people's lifestyles in the past.
And it's one of the things when people encountered the Inuit, one of the things they found, they had a lot of eye complaints, which they attributed to the smoke in their houses where they were burning soot from silfat lanterns and things of this nature.
Well, the other thing I've heard is that they often talk about how short beds were, and we have a Neolithic house here on site. And the evidence from places like Skara Brae, other Neolithic sites, is that the beds were very short, and ideas have circulated about, so you could sleep half sitting up, so you could jump up should your enemy approach. But I actually think that when you look at archaeological evidence, it's far more likely that people's lungs were quite badly damaged by smoke, and they had chronic lung conditions, and perhaps you physically had to sleep propped up in order to be able to breathe better.
Wow, that's
that
quite a
would
thought,
kind of
isn't it?
make more sense to me. It's not a very pleasant thought.
No.
Each house at Butser is based on the remains of an actual structure excavated somewhere in Britain.
So come on into a house which is enigmatically named CS1.
Oh, this
CS
is
standing for
great.
Circular Structure 1. So this house comes from Danebury Hillfort, Danebury being near Salisbury, and it had a large number of buildings. They think that people started building houses and structures up there around 600 BC. So inside here we've got furnishings arranged in ways that some of the archaeological evidence might suggest that this was a kind of representative layout. So over in this corner here, you get the cooking and food preparation area. And as you move round in a clockwise direction, you come to a seating area, potentially where the men may have spent their time. And as you move round here, you have a sleeping area. So the argument has been that it follows the movements of the sun. And that's a very logical, sort of functional argument. But I think actually the archaeological evidence has been selectively picked and chosen to support that argument. So we're not 100% sure. It makes sense that probably culturally people would have certain arrangements in their home which were recognisable to others, because if you have it, you need to be creating a system which other people understand how to fit into your system.
I think that's very common.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same if you're living in a tent today, you organise it in a certain way. And that's true of nomadic cultures and other tribal cultures around the world. There's a specific layout to the home. It is in our culture too, is that we have the hallway, don't we, where we leave
Exactly.
our outdoor clothing. So it's fascinating. Give me a picture of what we know about a family unit at that time.
Well, it was probably structured in a small nuclear family, but of course they would have had extended sort of kinship relationships. One of the things that's very interesting about hill forts and the idea that people started moving to hill forts in the Iron Age is that that represented a change in society and an increase in high status living, so perhaps a new culture of kings or very high status people.
When we come to a place like this today, everything looks a little dull and faded, but
Yeah.
actually life was more colourful than that.
Yes, absolutely. It's such a shame that this is what happens to stuff in your home when you have smoke like this filling your house all the time. But we know, if we look at some very rare archaeological evidence, but it's preserved in bogs or lakes, and if you look at some of those textiles, archaeologists have been able to very carefully discern what the original colours of those textiles were, because they can look at the dyes that were used. And the colours are unbelievably and exquisitely intense. But very interestingly, I read about an experiment a few years ago where they took a brand new piece of dyed, I can't remember if it was linen or whether it was something woolen, but they dyed it using natural pigments, and then they put it into lake conditions to represent what was found archaeologically. When they removed it 8 months later, it had gone from being the most intense red colour to being a sort of muddy brown colour. And that says it all. So the world would have been vibrant and people were wearing beautiful colours.
Fascinating,
Yeah.
isn't it? Life was hard. I mean, what was the life expectancy during the Iron Age?
If you made it past the age of about 5, you were onto a winner. You were probably going to survive into adulthood. So the first 5 years of life, and that's true up until probably the Industrial Revolution almost, that until the age of 5, you could succumb to a vast range of infectious diseases. But if you got that far, obviously your immune system must have been strong enough that you could have fought off a lot of other illnesses. And at that stage, you could have expected to live at least into your 40s, but many people lived on until their 60s. So to take the average age and say that everyone was dead by 40, it's not a very good way of looking at it, because really you just had to survive the first 5 years. And there's lots of evidence of people having lived into older age. In contrast, there is also lots of evidence, if you look at Egyptian mummies, that many people died very young of things that we'd never imagine dying of now. So I don't even like thinking about it because it's so horrific to imagine, but dental abscesses got lots of people. And if you look at what the quern stone is made of and how you grind grain on a quern stone, it's easy to understand how you're basically filling your grain with stone as you go, which you would be baking into the bread and ingesting. And as you grind down the enamel on your teeth, bit by bit, you're exposing the inner parts of your teeth and therefore exposing your teeth to infection.
I'm going off the Iron Age quickly.
People always say this about the past and how wonderful it might have been, but I say modern medicine has transformed the world we live in ways we could never imagine.
Absolutely right.
So all of the glorious aspects of the past and imagining living in a beautiful space like this might be offset by the risk of some simple things, like working with a flint tool. What happens if you cut yourself when you get an infection? There's no way of dealing with that. So people must have been made of strong stuff.
They must have been made of strong stuff. It's fascinating.
A huge amount of work has gone into these reconstructions, taking the best available evidence. Even so, there's much we don't know about how Iron Age Britons lived.
One of the things we need to always remember about experimental archaeology is that it can only ever show us what could have happened, not what definitely did happen. So these interpretations here are interpretations. Of course, these are logical interpretations because there's only so many ways that you can interpret a circular building, and each has some variable inside it. So the one that we've just come from, it had an outer wall of planks set in the ground with a roof on the top. So there's lots you can see. By a process of elimination, you can work out what the building could have looked like.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, so come inside and we'll have a look at this one.
Beautifully thatched.
It's brand new, pristine thatch. This house actually the archaeology comes from Wales. It's called Mollygardy. And in its first phase, it was a wattle and daubed walled structure, but very interestingly, later on, there was a second phase for the building where they replaced the wattle and daub walls with stone. So in the archaeology, obviously, the remains are much more obvious because there's still some stone in situ in the excavation. But that shows that these buildings might have been around for longer than we think.
Oh, this is beautiful.
So this house has had a bit of a makeover recently, which I think does make a big difference. So you saw the thatch from the outside, but you see on the inside what the thatch looks like before it becomes completely blackened by smoke.
It's not dark yet.
No.
But I mean, I guess there's no evidence for painting on the walls, but it's beautiful and it looks like it belongs. I mean, why not?
Absolutely. So this is what we wanted to do, is give a representation of what might have been. So we took some motifs which had been found in other objects from the Iron Age and we transported them onto wall paintings.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, aren't they lovely?
I mean, I look at these motifs, these designs, and we gain an insight into a culture that's gone, that was special. It was complex.
Well, look how incredibly detailed some of them are. Incredibly complex.
They're
and
beautiful. And they suggest a cosmological view of the world, because you see animals caught up within some of these motifs. It's fascinating.
Yeah, they're really lovely.
Really interesting. And what's lovely is that they're not all symmetrical. I love the asymmetry of some of these designs as well. It's beautiful. It's so mysterious. I just wish we knew more.
Of course. Doesn't everybody think how amazing it would be just to be transported back in time to walk into that world, or just be invisible and walk around watching everybody? It'd be awesome.
Amazing. Well, you can almost do that here. That's what's wonderful about Butser. It's, you feel as though you have made that journey back in time. I really like reconstructions like this. I mean, it's an amazing place. I can only imagine what it would have been like. I've worked with tribal cultures around the world that live in a similar way to the people who would have been here back in the past. I can hear children's voices, visualize them running, maybe hear in my mind the whinnying of a stallion in a paddock nearby, because these were people who valued horses. It's fascinating. There's so little known about this period in our history, but one thing's for certain: our ancestors at this time were incredibly sophisticated, artistic, creative people.
And so, with the Iron Age, I come to the end of my journey through Britain's prehistory.
It's a great thing to do, to walk a timeline like this. You can see the vast distance in history during which we used stone tools.
In contrast, the Iron Age lasts little more than 800 years, less than a metre on our timeline.
If I take one short step forwards, I come to the Roman invasion of Britain and the beginning of recorded history. Everything that we're certain about in our history, because it's written down, is found from this period forwards to the modern day in only 2 meters travel. An astonishing short period in time compared to the great length of our heritage.
The story of ancient Britain remains largely mysterious. There's so much still to be discovered, but I hope I've given you a flavour of what life was like for those who came before us. The people who had been walking these lands for 1 million years.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.